Hello, Year 7, and welcome to today's lesson. This is another lesson which is consolidating your knowledge. In this case, we're looking at one of the other poems we looked at this year, which is the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. To start off with, we're going to do a knowledge retrieval task. So these are questions about the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the kind of poem it is. The first question is, what is an allegory? What is an allegory? Remember, an allegory is a kind of story. What is an allegory? The second question, can you think of any examples of other types of stories which are often allegories? Third question, what evidence is there that Coleridge also wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to be an allegory? Think back to everything we learnt about the poem. And finally, a question you should find quite easy. What does the word connotation mean? What does connotation mean? So pause this presentation, write your answers to these questions, and then when you're ready, we'll move on and I'll give you some answers. So, the first question, what is an allegory? We should have put an allegory as a story with a deeper hidden meaning, often a moral or political one. And of course, we spent most of the first term studying an allegory, which was Animal Farm, a story with a deeper hidden meaning. Now, can you think of any examples of stories which are often allegories? Well, there are quite a few, but you might have put myths, legends, religious stories, fables. They're often all allegories. They often have a deeper meaning, and the story is trying to communicate some information about the world that the people who wrote it believed in. What evidence is there that Coleridge, the guy that wrote the poem, is a guy called Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in case you'd forgotten, he also wrote the Rime of the Ancient Mariner to be an allegory. Now, this would require you to remember a little bit about the story of the poem. So you might have remembered, for example, that it uses mythical characters like death or life in death. Remember, death claims the crew, life in death claims the mariner. And the mariner himself telling the story to the wedding guest. So the story itself comes across as a cautionary tale, and in this case it's to do with not messing about with the natural order of things. And finally, what does the word connotation mean? Well, hopefully you've remembered that a connotation is the deeper hidden meaning. Tick the ones that you got right, correct the ones that you didn't, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. First thing I'd like you to think about is the structure of the poem. And the structure is how the poem is presented to the reader. Now, we looked at the Kraken yesterday, and the Kraken is structured as a sonnet. It's a very particular poetic form. Other kind of poems that you might have come across are limericks, and a limerick has a very particular poetic form. Form, structure have to do with line length and stanza, and also the way in which the poem is presented on the page. So let's have a think about the structure of the part of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner that we looked at. So the first question is, how many lines does each verse have? How many lines does each verse have? Now take a look at that, because it's not as obvious as it seems. Now the first stanza has 4 lines, the second stanza has 5, then the third and the fourth have 4 lines, the fifth stanza has 6 lines, and the sixth stanza has 4 lines. So the structure, well, is that regular or irregular? Well, I think it's safe to say that that's an irregular structure. So the number of lines per stanza varies, and that leads to an irregular structure. Now let's have a think about the rhyme scheme. Let's have a look at the rhyme scheme. So we've got loud, sedge, cloud, edge. And that's regular. That's A, B, A, B. But then we've got still, side, crag, jag, wide. And a little bit like the Kraken, the rhyme scheme's varied. And we've got one line that doesn't rhyme at all, ends with still. And then we've got ship, on, moon, grown. And there you've got three half rhymes: on, moon, grown. And then uprose, eyes, dream, rise. You could argue that uprose and eyes are kind of like half rhymes, but eyes and rise do rhyme, dream and uprose don't. And then we've got on, blue, ropes, do, tools, crew. And in this case, you've got the second, the fourth, and the sixth lines rhyme. On, ropes, and tools don't rhyme at all, really. And finally, sun, knee, rope, me. And in this case, you've got knee and me rhyme. So basically, the poem has got an irregular rhyme scheme in the same way that it's got an irregular structure. And it's likely that this represents the mariner's state of mind, that it's reflexive of the fact that the mariner has broken the natural order of things by killing the albatross, and therefore the poem itself has been broken by the mariner. So the structure has gone irregular, and the rhyme scheme is irregular. Now, what is the tone of the poem? What attitude is the poet trying to convey? So when we think about tone, we're thinking about whether it is happy, sad, menacing, whatever. What would you describe as the tone of the poem, and why is the poet doing that? What sort of attitude is he trying to convey? Well, the tone is obviously very menacing. We've got a lot of pathetic fallacy here. We've got the wind roaring, we've got the moon and the clouds, we've got the lightning, and then we've got the dead men rising and groaning and steering the ship moving even though there's no wind. So the whole tone of the poem, the bit of the poem that we're looking at, is very frightening and creepy and chilling. And again, I think the poet here, Coleridge, he's trying to communicate the idea that this is not a natural thing, that because the mariner did this terrible thing, this unnatural act of murdering the albatross, now everything that's happening to him is menacing and scary and unnatural. I think that's the tone of it. And let's have a look. There is some repetition as well. Let's have a think about the repetition. At the opening stanza, and the coming wind did roar more loud, and the sails did sigh like sedge, and the rain poured down from one black cloud. So you got that repetition of and it feels like everything is piling down on top of the mariner. All these things are happening at the same time, and the repetition of and creates that effect. And then we've got the moon. The moon was at his edge. The thick black cloud was cleft and still. The moon was at its side. And then the next stanza, beneath the lightning and the moon. It keeps referring to the moon. Obviously, the moon has associations with witchcraft, has associations with night, it has associations with mystery. So I think the importance of the moon there is very powerful. In the fourth stanza, they groaned, they stirred, they all uprose. That repetition of they, emphasizing the arrival of the dead men, that they've been brought back to life by death. And he mentions the wind quite a lot. The wind did roar more loud. The loud wind never reached the ship. Never a breeze up blew. So the wind, which the mariner can sense, it never reaches the ship, which again gives the whole poem this sense of the strange and the unnatural and the weird. And so I think this repetition there really drives that home. Make sure that you've had a go at answering all those questions. If you need to, listen back to this section of the presentation to help you, and then move on to the next slide. Right, so I want you to think now about the rhyme scheme again. We talked about the rhyme scheme just a moment ago. And the first question, what do you notice about the rhyme scheme and the stanza length in this section of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner? What do you notice about the rhyme scheme and the stanza length in this section of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner? Well, like we just said, both the rhyme scheme and the stanza length are irregular. The rhyme scheme and the stanza length are irregular. Question 2. What could this suggest about the chaotic nature of the mariner's life after the shooting of the albatross? What could this suggest about the nature of the mariner's life after the shooting of the albatross? Well, it suggests that, like the poem, the mariner's life has gone wrong. It's gone irregular. It's out of kilter. It's out of sync. He is now in a world of dead men. He's in a world of the supernatural. His life is irregular in the same way that the poem is irregular. The poem has gone a bit chaotic, and the mariner's life has gone chaotic. The poem has gone out of control. The rhyme scheme keeps changing, the stanza length keeps changing, and the mariner's life has gone out of control. So I think that's what's represented here by the changes in the stanza length and the changes in the rhyme scheme. And why does the rhyme scheme become more consistent at the end when the speaker begins to feel more remorseful? It settles down a little bit. Well, I think I've kind of put the answer in the question there. I think the rhyme scheme does settle down because the speaker becomes remorseful. The mariner becomes remorseful because he recognises the impact that this has had on his nephew. That his nephew's died as a result of what he did, and perhaps the rhyme scheme is reflecting that. Once again, check your answers to those questions. If there's any that you're not sure about, listen to this bit of the presentation again. When you're ready, move on to the next slide. Right, so the next series of questions about the structure of the poem. And again, this is going over stuff that we talked about, so hopefully this should be fairly straightforward. Firstly, how does the repetition of "and" in the first stanza help create a sinister atmosphere in the poem? And the coming wind did roar more loud, and the sails did sigh like sedge, and the rain poured down from one black cloud. So and, and. How does it create a sinister atmosphere? Well, I think it creates a sort of ominous sense of something about to happen. It's almost like the tolling of a mysterious bell, or it reminds me a little bit some of Bible passages or old-fashioned writing, that repetition of and I think it creates a sense of tension. What's going to happen? All of these things are happening at the same time, and this is happening, and this is happening, and this is happening, and it builds up the menace. We're waiting to find out what's going to happen. So that's how I think that "and" creates a sinister atmosphere. Why does the poet keep mentioning the moon? We've got the moon at the edge of the black cloud, the moon at the side of the black cloud, the moon above the dead men. Why does the poet keep mentioning the moon? What is the significance of the moon? Well, obviously, the moon is associated with the supernatural. It's associated with darkness, with the night. And here it's creating that grim, spooky atmosphere. If we imagine the scene lit by moonlight from a black sky, we can imagine the silvery light on the dead men and the ship floating in the water underneath the black clouds and the lightning. Why might the narrative perspective change from first person singular to first person plural at the end of the fifth stanza when the poet says, or the narrator says, "We were a ghastly crew"? Most of the poem is told from the first person, I, from the mariner's point of view. Suddenly he switches to we. Why do you think he does that? What does the we signify? We were a ghastly crew. Write your answer down. Well, I think it signifies the mariner sees himself as a dead man. He sees himself as a corpse, that he is only alive because of supernatural forces. Now remember, the crew are dead. They've been taken by death. Death won them in a game. But the mariner has been claimed by life in death. So the mariner is a living dead man, that he is still alive, but effectively he is a kind of undead thing. And when we meet the mariner at the start of the poem, he is basically wandering the earth in this kind of undead body, telling his story to whoever will listen. It's his punishment for what he did. And this kind of living death that he's been cursed with, this curse of immortality, is one of those things that sometimes happens in myths and legends and in allegories. It's like, be careful what you wish for. So I think the we suggests the mariner sees himself as a dead man, like the rest of the crew. Question 4. Why might the poem, or this bit of the poem, end with the realization the speaker's nephew is one of the ship's ghostly sailors? Why do you think that happens towards the end of this particular section? Write your answer down. Well, I think it's done because it has a tremendous dramatic impact, that suddenly the mariner realizes that his actions have had this terrible consequence, that he has in fact been responsible for the death of his brother's son. And that really brings home that this is a child, a young man, that is his nephew, and he describes it as the body, that he has been responsible for the death of one of his relatives. And that absolutely hammers home the tragedy of the mariners' actions, what they've caused. And I think that tragedy is really emphasized by coming at the end of that section. Question 5. The poem is mainly written in quatrains, and quatrains are 4-line stanzas. So in that section, stanza 1, 3, 4, and 6, they're all quatrains. But the second stanza is a quintain, and that comes from the Latin word for 5. And the fifth stanza is a sestet, and that comes from the Latin word for 6. Now, why do you think the poem changes its structure? And we've already mentioned this at least twice, so you should easily be able to get this one. As we've mentioned, the poem at this point, the story has hit a really supernatural twist, and it's no longer a story about a sea voyage. It's a story about ghosts and undead creatures and supernatural forces and the dead coming back to life, and the whole world has been turned upside down. The world of the mariner has become a world of the uncanny and the unusual and the twisted. And the poem itself, a little bit like the Kraken, the poem itself has broken because of that. The power of the supernatural has fragmented the poem. It's no longer just 4-line stanzas, quatrains. Suddenly it's breaking up, like the mariner's life is breaking up and cracking and shattering. So we've got this really interesting idea that the structure of the poem is reflecting the mariner's state, that his world is falling apart and the poem is breaking apart. It's not following the rules. And I think that's why that's happened. So check your answers. Again, if there's any you're not sure about, go back over this part of the presentation, write them in, and then when you're ready, move on to the next slide. Now, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is very much a poem which has a horror and gothic elements to it. And I want to think about how Coleridge, the poet, creates horror in his poem. So I've got some questions for you now, and I'd like to answer these in complete sentences in your books. Question 1. How do the following words or phrases create a sense of horror? The rain poured down from one black cloud. How does that create a sense of horror? The lightning fell with never a jag. Now remember what that means is the lightning was like sheet lightning across the sky, like a river, it says. So it wasn't jagged lightning like we would traditionally see in a horror. It's sheet lightning lighting up the entire sky. Yet now the ship moved on. Now bear in mind that the ship moved on even though there's no wind. So why does that create an effect of horror? The ship moving on without any wind. The dead men gave a groan. Well, that should be fairly straightforward, shouldn't it? How does that create a sense of horror? They raised their limbs like lifeless tools. Again, should be fairly straightforward. How does that create a sense of horror? Have a go answering those questions, and then I'll go through some answers with you. So the rain poured down from one black cloud. The rain has connotations of misery and of sadness, and in this case, the black cloud has connotations of darkness and grimness and death. So it's very much a horror movie convention. The rain pouring down, and I think that's what's happening here. This image of horror, this pouring rain coming from the blackness and the night. The lightning fell with never a jag, and this idea of the sky lighting up white against the black, and I think that's almost symbolic of death and life and death, because death is dressed in black and life and death is dressed in white. And again, lightning is very much a convention of horror, the creation of mood, and I think that's what's happening here. Yet now the ship moved on. Well, the idea, this is a sailing ship, and the idea of a sailing ship moving without the wind is very creepy because it shouldn't be moving. So it creates a very strange image, the ship moving without the wind. The dead men gave a groan, they raised their limbs like lifeless tools. Well, both of these images, the men are dead. So the fact that they are doing things that living men would do, but in a ghastly and scary way, that adds to the sense of horror. It's the most obviously graphic, horrific moment in that paragraph, those stanzas. Basically, the dead coming back to life. It's like a zombie movie. Now, the technique of pathetic fallacy is used to create a horrific mood as well. So, how do you think that is done? How is pathetic fallacy used to create a horrific mood? Write your answer down. So pathetic fallacy is where the weather reflects emotion, and obviously the rain pouring down, that connotes sadness, and obviously the mariner is heartbroken because all of his friends are dead, and suddenly in this horrific situation, then we get the lightning, and that creates that sense of horror that the sky itself is cracking because the mariner is done. And we've got a strong wind blowing in the distance. And again, that wind, that creepy wind, is very much a convention of horror. How is the detail that ship moves without wind? How does that create a horrific mood? Write your answer down. Well, as we've mentioned, this idea of a ship, a sailing ship, which needs wind to move, moving even though the wind is nowhere near the ship, creates a really spooky effect. The idea of something moving without any agency to move it creates a really scary image in the reader's mind. What do you think the most horrific image in the poem is, and why? Well, I can't answer that question because it's up to you. It's your opinion. So I'd like you to read back through the poem. I'd like you to decide what you think the most horrific image is. Explain why. And when you've done that, move on to the next slide, please. Right, here is a waggle. I'm going to read this to you. It's what a good one looks like. And the question is, how does Coleridge create a sense of horror in the rime of the Ancient Mariner? And here's the answer. Throughout the rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge creates a sense of horror at the speaker's arrogant actions in shooting the albatross, a symbol of hope and good luck. And that, as you'll see, is the point sentence. This is seen in the opening stanza of this section, which reflects the sombre and sullen mood of the ship and the speaker's regret. It is noted that the rain poured down from one black cloud and the wind did roar more loud. So here is our example. We've got two quotations used to explain how Coleridge creates a sense of horror. There are others that you could choose, but these are the two that I chose. This demonstrates a use of pathetic fallacy. See, I've used some key vocabulary there. On one level, the rain could show that the weather has turned bad and stormy as the sailors continue their journey. On another level, the black rain could symbolize a punishment or judgment on the speaker for being destructive and arrogant. And here you've got my explanation. This is how I'm showing how those quotations show a sense of horror. The adjective black connotes anger, fear, death. It represents how the speaker is in a living hell because of his actions. In addition, the verb poured indicates the rain was falling relentlessly and heavily, emphasizing the fact that the speaker's punishment is not going to end. So here we've got our analysis. I've analyzed two words, black and poured, and I've given reasons why I think the poet has used those words. And finally, Coleridge might be suggesting that people always have to face the consequences of their actions, like the mariner does. He could also be suggesting that actions can have effects not just on the person who does them, but on those around them. And I think that this is basically to do with, that's not a great colour, is it? I think that bit is Coleridge, the effect on the audience. So you can see in the yellow, we've got the point. In the green, we've got the evidence. Orange, explanation. Blue, analysis. And then the final bit, which is effect on the audience. So that is what a good one looks like. When you come to write your PEA paragraph next week, hopefully yours will look as good as that. So I've already done this. The point gives the basic answer. The evidence provides a quotation to support the point. The explanation explains how the evidence proves the point. And the analysis gives a key word, explores its connotations, and then we have context. We've got the effect on the reader, the poet's intention, and using subject terminology. So let's take another look at that. Throughout the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, Coleridge creates a sense of horror at the speaker's arrogant actions in shooting the albatross. And there is the point. This is seen in the opening stanza of the section, which reflects the sombre and sullen mood of the ship and the speaker's, the mariner's regret. It's noted that the rain poured down from one black cloud and the wind did roar more loud. So there is my evidence. This demonstrates the use of pathetic fallacy. On one level, the rain could show that the weather has turned bad and stormy as the sailors continue their journey. On another level, the black rain could symbolize a punishment or a judgment on the speaker for being destructive and arrogant. And there is my explanation. The adjective black connotes anger, fear, and death. It represents how the speaker is in a living hell because of his actions. In addition, the verb poured indicates that the rain was falling relentlessly and heavily, emphasizing the fact that the speaker's punishment is not going to end. And there is my analysis. Finally, my effect on the audience, my context in this case. Coleridge might be suggesting that people will always have to face the consequences of their actions, like the mariner does. It could also be suggesting that actions can have effects not just on the person who does them, but on those around them. And that is my summary. So that is what a good one looks like. Hopefully now you feel a little bit more confident with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and a little bit more confident with writing PEEA paragraphs. Tomorrow we will take a look at By the Sea, and hopefully we'll be doing that face to face. So hopefully for the last time, oh, and don't forget, you don't need to submit any work. You don't need to hand it in apart from in your books. For the last time, that is it.